Hello, ladies and gentlemen. While everyone gets settled, I'm Steve Erlanger from the New York Times. You may have seen me flounder around last night. As a moderator, I will try to flounder around the same way right now. We have a very hot topic. I'm not sure it has all that much to do with democracy, but it has a lot to do with our futures. We are at a very difficult moment with the potential of a much wider war in the region. In that sense, fate seems to be in the hands of many extremists who are running the trains in all these societies. We now, in a way, have a four-front war, if you count Gaza, the West Bank, which is the front of the war, Lebanon, and now Iran. So it's a very difficult moment. So we have in front of us an extraordinarily good and I think very diverse panel. And I'm going to try to get out of the way. But first, I would ask, you can look up everyone in your catalogs. I'm not going to introduce everybody. But first, let's go with Nomi Bar-Yaacov, who works in peace negotiations and dual track. But I'm just going to ask the opening question, which is, we're now at the brink of what could be something even more terrible than what we've already seen. What's the context? How did we really get here?
Okay. Well, thank you, Stephen, for having me on this panel, and thank you to the Athens Democracy Forum for inviting me. I think we are at a pivotal moment, at a tipping point in this conflict, and as Stephen said, it's important to explore how we got here, and I think we need to all look kind of internally at ourselves, searching for our own truth and for the individual and the collective, and work out what could have been done better. So clearly there are states that contributed to this conflict, and very powerful ones indeed. And of the democratic states, I think it's important to point to the fact that the United States allowed for settlements to expand and vetoed numerous resolutions that could have helped to build trust and contribute to resolving the conflict. And I point to the US because I point to states that consider themselves a role model democracy in the world. Of course, there are many states that have played a destructive part. But at the heart of this lies the Palestinians' right to self-determination and right to statehood. And unless the Palestinians get a sovereign, independent, contiguous state, and unless they are international, implementable, serious security guarantees, both to the Palestinian state and to the Israeli state. And at this very difficult moment, it's not easy after the horrors, the slaughter, the rapes, the absolute unimaginable events of 7th of October a year ago, which were also supported by the majority of Palestinians in the West Bank and many, not all, Muslims around the world. It is very, very difficult for Israel to understand how a Palestinian state will make it more secure. And I think that's what the focus of the future needs to be if we're trying to work out how to get there. Because if Israel isn't convinced, and I am convinced that the Palestinian state is in Israel's national security interest, then we're going to get more and more and more cycles of war. And that's a failure of states and civil society, because there's very little debate about how to get there, and it is absolutely critical. For example, Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, didn't mention Palestine in his speech, and in response to that, the Jordanian foreign minister, Ayman Safadi, said, here we are in the UN, 57 Islamic and Arab states willing to support Israeli peace on condition that there will be a Palestinian state.
Right.
And I have no doubt that he and his Saudi counterparts meant what they were saying. That's because I'm involved in, and have been involved for decades in negotiations. The question is, again, I state, how do you persuade, how do you reach out to the people? Because there is a crisis in leadership. With this current government in Israel and with this will be my last statement, and with this current government in Israel and current government in Palestine, we're not going to get to peace. But we need to think beyond this current government and the next government and prepare the people of both nations, the Israeli and the Palestinians, on how to move forward. Thank you very much.
Good, thanks, because obviously efforts at creating a regional solution have somehow led to a regional war.
Yes.
And it's very difficult when you have two traumatized people competing over their trauma. This is obviously part of the emotional problem. I think some Israelis wouldn't give Palestinians right now a nail clipper, let alone a state. But we need to get there. So next I will turn to Ahmed Shabat Eldin, who is, if I can say, a Kuwaiti American but of Palestinian descent.
Correct.
And if you can't see him, has wonderful slippers in Palestinian colors on
correct.
his feet.
Yeah.
So,
These days,
Ahmed,
thank you so much. These days I have to carry Palestine with me everywhere. I just want to build briefly on what you said, and I appreciate your framing. I mean, let's just be honest and address the elephant in the room. The fact is, without meaningful pressure from the US on Israel, it's practically impossible to imagine or have a conversation about ceasefire, let alone peace. I say this because if we want peace, we have to learn the lessons of history, whether it's Iraq, Vietnam, or any other conflict where dehumanization, one of the stages of genocide, for example, and media complicity, I should say, in dehumanization, manufacturing consent for whether genocide or ethnic cleansing needs to be addressed. So long as Israel is able to annex, occupy, murder, starve with impunity, which is a fact, and violate not just legal norms, but moral norms, day after day, since October 7th. A horrific event happened on October 7th, but every day horrific events have happened since for a year. So, you know, as a student of history, Stephen, history teaches us, as I'm sure you know, that without accountability, peace is not possible. And I worry that today, you know, I started my career just a few years after 2003 during the Iraq invasion. I started my career at the New York Times. And part of my job was to write headlines from the newspaper to the digital. And I worry that we're in the same juncture, that the US administration is repeating the same mistakes of 2003 and that the media is repeating the same mistakes. You know, we can't underline this enough. We really stand on the brink of disaster now. A serious attack by by Israel on Iran's oil, facilities or nuclear facilities, I mean, that would be catastrophic. And so this is a moment for de-escalation, but it's also a moment for honesty. We really need to focus, as I think you alluded to, on the root cause of October 7th, of the genocide, of everything I've mentioned, which is the occupation of Palestine and the dehumanization and collective punishment of those people. And if I may just make a couple quick points to frame the conversation. I mean, look at the data in the US. You know, I know that you said, maybe rightfully, that today this panel is not really about democracy, but in a democracy like the US, which I think I can kindly say is debilitated at best in this moment, 83% of Democrats support a ceasefire. Almost 80% of Democrats want weapons to stop to Israel. They want the US to stop sending weapons. And yet, here we are. The former CIA director, Leon Panetta, described Israel's attacks on Lebanon with pagers and devices as an act of mass terror. So we're fighting terrorism with terrorism? Never mind the origins of the Israeli state and how it was established. Now, I just want to say, there have been reports yesterday that Iran has warned the US privately that any attack on their refineries would mean retaliation against Saudi Arabia, Azerbaijan, Kuwait, the UAE, and Bahrain. I mean, those are the stakes. So I'll end by saying, so long as Israel and the US and the US's allies, including Arab states, continue to ignore Palestinian human rights and perpetuate dehumanization, as history teaches us repeatedly and relentlessly, oppressed people, robbed of their basic human rights and dignity, will always resist. Whether that resistance comes through the pen or the sword, they will always resist. Whether we think they have a right to resist or not, which they do, they will always resist. So until we recognize that Palestinians deserve human rights, legal rights, there can be no peace. Not because I say so, because history teaches us this. So I hope in part of this conversation we can actually address the elephant in the room, which is the obscene impunity that Israel enjoys, because it makes Israelis less safe, as well as all of us.
This is why we have these conversations. It's really important. This whole thing is called a moment of truth. Mm-hmm. Different people have different truths, but your truth is legitimate, and I'm very glad you were so open about it.
Thank you.
Because one thing I've learned covering this conflict, and I hope Israel remembers this now, it's very easy to go in, it's very hard to get out.
Mm-hmm.
And let's see what happens. My first visit to Israel was in 1983 at the Awali River, when the Israeli army was pulling out of Lebanon after it thought it could defeat the PLO there. And I remember talking to an Israeli intelligence officer who was guiding me. I was this kid. And he said, "You see this building over there?" We were in southern Lebanon. He said, "That window, we knew the gun was in that window. What we didn't know was the Shia would turn against us." Mm-hmm. So this is the problem of knowing a lot and not knowing enough.
True.
So, Roger, let me turn to you, particularly to help us understand the American, if you don't mind, involvement in this, responsibility. Can a Biden administration influence what's happening? And then whatever else you want to say.
Well, the United States and every other power in the world, and I recently wrote this, has proved unable over almost a year to contain the reverberations from the Hamas attack on October 7 in Israel. There have been, I don't know how many statements from the Biden administration saying that an agreement in the negotiations was imminent. It has never happened. The reverberations are too strong, and now, of course, they have engulfed Lebanon. They are engulfing Iran, and Ahmed said we're on the verge of a disaster. I think we're in a disaster. We are living a disaster. The disaster is real. Mm-hmm. Before I get to America, I would like to say that I thought what Ahmed said illustrated the impossibility of resolving this conflict. Because when it comes to this conflict, there are two narratives. There's the narrative of the Jews, of the Israeli people, and there's the narrative of the Palestinians. And there is a small sliver of land, and the two peoples have claims, historical claims, to that land. The State of Israel came into being through Resolution 181 of the United Nations in 1947. It wasn't an act of God. It wasn't a colonial invasion. It was the result of a resolution that called for two. It's worth reading. It's probably the best. And the people who wrote it were very reluctant to write it. They just couldn't see a better outcome. So they proposed two states, a Palestinian Arab state an Israeli state, and 4% of the territory allocated to international supervision in and around Jerusalem, with all the holy sites accessible. Nobody, at least in my view, in 76 years, has come up with a better idea. But 5 Arab armies, of course, invaded Israel at the outset, and the rest, as we say, is history. I was struck that October 7, in Ahmed's statement, this heinous Hamas attack on Israel was a subordinate clause. It's really become a subordinate clause since it happened, dwarfed by the appalling killing in retaliation in Gaza, which has led to the deaths of 41,000 Palestinians. I'm always cautious. I covered the Bosnian War. At the end of the war, we were all talking about 200,000 dead. It turned out to be 100,000. War is fog. War is fog. We don't know the exact number, but it doesn't matter. There are a lot of innocent people who have been killed. Now, of course, for Israelis, it's not a subordinate clause. It's not. You know, I was in Israel on October 9. I was at the trans site 2 days later. I saw the hammocks. I saw the tents. I saw the toys. I saw the Coca-Cola. I saw the stage. I could imagine these kids, many of them high, with the sun coming up, pointing to the fireworks. They weren't fireworks. They were the traces of rockets. And 400 almost of those kids were hunted down. It all happened in a eucalyptus glade. On the road, there's one road out of there. Hamas came from here, from there. So in the end, there were these mountains of cars with their doors thrown open, and those who tried to survive ran across the fields to try to escape. This is not a subordinate clause. This reawakened a very fundamental trauma in the Jewish people and in Israelis concerning their own post-Holocaust survival. Jews tried relying on the kindness of strangers once before. They are not going to do it again. They are not. They're not. 6 million was enough. They will fight for their survival. Now, that said, I agree totally. I agree with Ahmed. I think Ahmed recognizes the right of Israel to exist. I wasn't sure what he meant about Israel's founding when he spoke, and Nomi, I know, believes in 2 states. I've argued for 2 states for 30 years, and it is the only possible outcome that brings peace. You can choose to live in the suppurating wounds of history until the end of time, or you can choose a future for your children. Israelis and Palestinians have not yet reached the point where they're prepared to make that difficult, painful decision. Compromise is painful. I covered the Bosnian War. 49% of Bosnia went to the aggressor. Now, would it be worth another 100,000 lives to have fought for a better outcome? Each of us will come to a different conclusion on that. On America, I haven't forgotten your question, Steve.
No, that's okay.
I would just
do that a bit.
I'll say it. I mean, I think the United States could look. There's an ironclad alliance between the United States and Israel. The United States sees Israel's survival not as a given, but as something that needs to be defended and supported. And the vast majority of Americans agree with that, not just Jewish Americans. Most Americans see the survival of Israel, a democratic state, white colonial settler Israel. Israel's not white. There are 2.2 million Palestinians. Well, there are many Africans. There are Indian. Anyway, I won't go off on that. But on the United States, yes, I think the Biden administration, it said that what Israel has done has been over the top. I agree with that. And could take measures with respect to the flow of arms to Israel. It will never cut off that supply of arms. It could cut, as Baker did 35 years ago, where it could threaten to cut some of that supply if Israel does not do X, Y, Z. Israel, of course, is a profoundly political subject in the United States. For any administration to do that is not straightforward. But yes, I think the United States could have done more.
Okay, good. I mean, we can obviously come back to it. I'm sorry but I'm trying to
I'm
cut everybody off. Yeah. But I mean, one of the things that's always bothered me...
I'm waiting for the applause.
Yes, applause. One of the things... That's always troubled me trying to cover American policy, particularly the Middle East, is I think American administrations, Republican and Democratic, have actually seen what Netanyahu wanted to do in the West Bank, wanted to separate West Bank and Gaza, wanted to settle the West Bank, make a viable state almost impossible. We talked about it,
Tragic
Americans,
mistake.
and did nothing to stop it. And so, we are where we are, and you can't go backwards. But
I mean, Nomi said
I
that.
do feel this. Yeah.
You know.
So, Mabel, we're putting you in a very difficult position because this is not your subject, but this is a conflict that threatens a much larger economic crisis, big disruption. Iran is part of the BRICS, along with China. If you can talk a bit about how China sees this conflict, how the so-called global South sees it, that would be really helpful, and thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you very much for having me. It's my great privilege and pleasure to be at Athens Democracy Forum once again. Yes, I'm not expert on this Middle East region, but from a Chinese perspective, I think China's position stance on Middle East crisis is consistent and crystal clear. The stability and the peace of this region aligns with China's national interests. And I believe China is a natural mediator of this Middle East crisis. You know why? For example, China is the largest trading partner of all the GCC members and the largest trading partner of most of the Middle East countries, as well as the second largest trading partner of Israel. Suez Canal is vital for China's 21st century maritime Silk Road. This region is not just the largest, biggest market of China, but also it's very, very vital for the link of international trade routes. And China has no any historical burden on this region. We have not invaded or interfered in this region's domestic and regional affairs. China also has great credibility and the good track record to establish the diplomatic ties between Iran and Saudi. Therefore, I think China has another further step. Recently rallied 14 political factions of Palestinian leaders gathered in Beijing to issue the Beijing Declaration to end their long-standing feud and get unity of that Palestinian people. Additionally, I think China has a great credibility to put their agenda on this region's mediation. China recently also proposed a three-step approach on the Middle East crisis. The first step is going to promote the ceasefire, and the second step is going to push forward the Palestinian governing Palestine principle, and the most important step is going to have the implementation of the two states solution.
Right.
I think China has done a lot of those, I think, good and positive diplomatic efforts to mediate this region.
It was also China is buying a lot of Iranian oil despite sanctions, but China had been very helpful in the P5 effort to control Iran's nuclear program, something Donald Trump then pulled out of. The JCPOA, now China and Russia seem much less invested in keeping Iran's nuclear program down. So that's, to me, also an interesting moment. But let's try to get a bit deeper into the narrative question, Ahmed. I know you want to respond.
Well,
so,
yeah, if I
so
may,
please do.
I appreciate it. Just because you asked, Roger, I mean, look, this is called the moment of truth, so I can only be truthful. My truth, perhaps, but I think based in fact. The truth is Israel is not a democracy. is not a democracy. And I'm not saying this to be provocative. The reason I'm saying this, and I do think Israel has a right to exist, but I definitely don't think it has a right to exist the way it currently is existing. And when I reference the inception of the Israeli state, just bear with me, thank you. When I reference the inception of the Israeli state, as the New York Times reported in the 30s and 40s, it was founded through terrorism, through terrorist militias. These are facts that are in the past, perhaps, and I'm not trying to be provocative, but I'm trying to be fair. You know, the reason I say this is Israel is an ethnocracy.
What was the Irgun fighting? Ahmed, what was the Irgun fighting?
Look,
British colonialism.
Fair enough. And colonialism is alive and well today, and Israel has inherited that responsibility, if you will. But Roger, let's just be, you know, when we say Israel is a democracy, when we ignore the way in which the media continues to kind of present Israel as civilized and democratic, when in reality, sure, it has a veneer of democracy, but it's a settler colonial state in which one ethno-national group dominates over another, in which one group of people have a right to return and another don't. Now, all I want to say on the note of how we get out of this, because I think it's important to look forward. This panel is really about, is lasting peace possible? And I think, again, history teaches us that the only way it's possible is if we're honest with ourselves as people from the media perspective and with the audience about the reality on the ground. And I think for those of us paying attention, we live in a very different era than 10, 20 years ago when there were other sort of flashpoints or conflicts or acute crises in the region. Now, information is decentralized, democratized. And again, I'm very, very humbled and honored to be here, but I must say, is it helping us get to peace when organizations like the BBC and the New York Times, two of which I have worked for and have respect for example, the leaked memo in April that says, you know, where the New York Times is telling reporters not to say refugee camp or call it a former UN school or to avoid saying occupation or Palestine. What is the purpose of that, and how does avoiding occupation, which is the root cause of the issue, gonna get us closer to peace? So the last thing I just want to say is, it's mind-boggling to me, and I'm not pointing fingers here, but just in general, how the discourse is completely illogical, which is October 7th, nothing can, you know, before October 7th can justify what Hamas did, the heinous crimes as you described them. But somehow the media and politicians are reminding us and telling us over and over that October 7th can in fact justify October 8th, October 9th, October 10th, and where we are today.
Sure. I mean, I must say, I never got that particular memo, and I'm never paid.
Yeah,
I mean, I sort of read about it, but anyway, it doesn't
Yeah,
really
no,
matter.
that's, I mean,
It's just that editors are struggling, as they always do.
I understand,
In
I
a
mean-
futile kind of way to try to seem balanced,
and-
whatever that means.
No, and
right?
Stephen, please just,
No,
if I
I'm
may very
just-
quickly, it's not about the New York Times.
No, of
this
course
is
not.
This is a
No,
pervasive problem.
I mean, I'm just
Like-
saying it's, you know, editing is a mess, which you always
Fair enough,
know.
fair
It's
enough.
very difficult.
But also-
So
yeah.
Nomi, let me, sorry, I mean,
No, go ahead.
let's try to do that. I mean, you're working on track 2 issues. You talk to the Qataris, you talk to lots of people. I mean, do you see a future out of this? I mean, Israel thinks at the moment, at least Bibi, who seems pretty messianic right now, thinks he can change the structure of what surrounds Israel, that this is a moment to change, at least to buy Israel 5 or 10 years of peace. I don't know what he thinks precisely, but I mean, are there what's your sense of an alternative? And I will come to both of you as well.
I said at the outset that the current Israeli and Palestinian governments are not going to be the ones bringing peace. And it's true for both sides. So, and I know particularly, it's very clear that Benjamin Netanyahu is not moving towards peace. And I know that's what he said in the UN, but I don't think that's what he's thinking. I'm not sure that don't want to comment too much about what he's thinking or not thinking, but it's not always very clear what his real thinking is. And sometimes I wonder whether he himself is clear on it. But I do think it's very important. Did I hear you correctly saying you don't think Israel has a right to exist?
No.
No, he said the opposite.
I said it's like in the way that it's existing now, no state should have a right to do what Israel is doing.
Okay.
Whether to the Palestinians or to the Lebanese or to the region, as we've heard, Roger rightly said, we're in a disaster. And I think Israel is not fully to blame, but Netanyahu is certainly largely to blame.
No. Israel is very much, I think, is part of, Roger focused on the psychology in Israel, and I think it's very important post-Holocaust to understand the psychology, the history, and the different narratives. And you don't need to agree with the other narrative, but you do need to study it, be aware of it, and respect it. And unless you know what the other side's narrative is and where there are truths, sometimes there are factual errors, those you can, discuss. It's not the kind of Rashomon case scenario. You can actually say, well, actually, there was terror also on this side and on that side, because each side tends to focus only on their trauma, as Stephen said, and both societies are deeply traumatized, very, very deeply so, and both societies feel very insecure. And Israel elected in a democratic process a government that is acting very fast, in an anti-democratic fashion.
With all due respect, I agree, but Hamas was also elected in a democratic process.
And who were the countries that imposed those three conditions on them?
Exactly.
Yes, it was not Israel. I mean, it was Europe. It was all the
Let's
EU
not
countries.
get too
sidetracked.
deep into
No,
the weeds
I'm just responding. Ahmed
of the
mentioned
2007 election. Okay, please.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
Yeah. No, it was the 2006 election with the 2007 coup in Gaza.
Right.
So, it was also the infighting.
Right.
It wasn't
so let's
only...
not do that.
Oh, okay, no, I must just
My
respond.
mistake.
Why not? But broadly speaking, it's very clear that the processes at the moment, as we all said, are not positive ones. And I think the purpose of this forum is how to try to move forward. And I'd just like, for example, and where to draw the resources to move forward, because I think we all agree on this panel that the two states is the only way forward.
I disagree, but let's not get mired in that.
Are you
either.
a one-state person?
I just believe you have to start when you're talking about peace with acknowledging that all human beings living on the land, regardless of where the land is, have basic human rights and dignity and protection, legally. And if that's one state, that's great. The two-state to me is just an obfuscation. It's a way of kicking the can down the line. Contiguously with the Bantustan reality, how do you build? I mean, I don't want to derail.
I don't think we have time in a minute and 16 seconds to get into the details of how to get there. Just broadly, very quickly, I'd like to highlight that former Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, who is the one that launched the war into Lebanon when he was Prime Minister, and Nasser al-Kidwa, nephew of Yasser Arafat and former foreign minister of Palestine, have come up recently in the last few weeks with a peace plan for Israel and Palestine. And I think that plan, which is a framework, which is a reiteration, just updated post-Gaza, is the way forward.
Okay, great. Mabel, quickly, then Roger.
Yes.
Please.
Today our topic is democracy. I think this topic on this panel is very linked. You know why? Actually, the international democracy has been undermined because of this issue. As the United Nations already issued numerous resolutions on this problem, but there's no implementation at all. So you ask me the attitude from the Global South. The Global South countries, they think there's no international democracy at all. As the UN is the foundation of, after the Second World War, is Bretton Woods foundation, but the resolution cannot be implemented, voted by majority of the people on the earth. It cannot be implemented. What is democracy? What is international democracy from? So I think the sovereignty of the Palestinian state should be respected. The territorial integrity of these regions, Lebanon and the other countries, should be respected. all the human rights individuals in this region should be respected.
Yeah.
That is international democracy.
Okay,
So
thank
right
you.
now, there's no international democracy. This is a manifestation for that.
Okay,
we leave, if
Roger,
you
you will have the last word and say whatever you like.
with a dress.
Respond to whatever you like.
Well, thank you, Steve. Well, I wish I was as young as Ahmed and could dream like him. And wouldn't it be nice if there was a United States of the Holy Land in which two peoples who've been through what they've been through over the past decades, two peoples who would in this imaginary state mark the Nakba and the joy of independence on the same day somehow. I wish, no, it's not going to happen. Maybe one day if there were two states, the border would become as irrelevant as the border between France and Germany. There would be no logic to it anymore. That would be my dream. Yes, there is an occupation. Yes, there is an occupation of the West Bank. And Israel was drawn into it through hubris, and it was an undermining mistake. It was a very powerful temptation because Jews became a people of the land. That's where the story began, more than 3,500 years ago, on that very land, on that land. So the temptation is understandable, but I view it as a mistake. As for democracy, well, the U.S. democracy is in great shape, isn't it? The perfect can't be the enemy of the good. Israel still has an independent judiciary that is hanging on. It's a very imperfect democracy, and its fundamental flaw lies in the occupation of the West Bank, where there are citizens, who are the Israeli settlers, and then there are people who exist outside the rule of law, and that is not compatible with any democracy. But I would argue, yes, that an Israeli democracy exists. The 2.2 million Palestinian citizens of Israel, they have representation in the Knesset. They are lawyers, they're doctors, they have businesses, they have a press. Is the treatment precisely as good, the same, as with the Jewish citizens of Israel? No, it's not, and that could be improved. But if you're a minority in the Middle East, would you rather be the Kurds of Turkey? Would you rather be the Copts of Egypt? Would you rather be the Jews of Baghdad, Damascus, Cairo, Tunis? Oh yeah, there aren't any more of those Jews, right? 800,000 of them had to flee because of what happened after 1948. Nobody speaks about their return. That minority, those minorities, disappeared. The history is complex. The history is infinitely complex. And a solution will come the day that people say the future is more important than the past. I'll just conclude by saying I love a poem by Ben Alamika, and I can't quote it exactly, but it's called The Tourists. And it involves a group of tourists in the old city of Jerusalem who are being told by their guide that, you see that guy with the bags, the shopping bags? Just to the right of it, there lies an ancient tower. There stands an ancient tower, and the beauty of it is extraordinary. And then he writes, peace will only come to the Holy Land when the guide says, you see that tower? See that tower? It's not important. Next to it, there sits a man who just bought fruit and vegetables for his family. It's not the past that's going to solve this. It's belief in a better future.
Okay, great.